Go ahead and get started because we had a bunch of slides and I don't want to, well, we're going to run out of time. We'll try not to run out of time. And if we run out of time, guys, you can ask me or my questions afterwards. We'll hang around, so feel free to ask them. Title, Can It Be Done? Building a Successful Business Around Open Licensed Software and Content. I'm going to give our caveats here in just a minute of what we know and what we don't know and what we're making of. But that's the idea here, is that I think that there are lots of opportunities to make money off of open source, but to do it in a healthy way. It's not as cannibalistic, parasitic sort of relationship. We can have a very healthy relationship and have businesses that are successful and actually feed back to the success of open projects. And that's what I want to try to help people understand that it's possible. Case in point, in structure, I feel like we've done that. So Canvas is our learning management system. Canvas is open source. The product is out there. Anybody can use it. We have a number of organizations that have forked our code for their own purposes or have taken it and run it just for their own institution, and that's great. But we continue to grow the product. We offer services around Canvas, right? So the hosting and the support and the training and implementation and all that, and it's worked out very well for us. We have over 550 institutions that are using Canvas as a mission-critical piece of their infrastructure. The LMS is not just this little pet project, right? This is a big piece of what the institution does, and it's actually part of the brand. So we're very happy with the growth that we've seen. We have, these numbers are a little outdated, we have almost 10 million people that are on Canvas now, that use Canvas. I think that's awesome. 250 employees. It was founded in 2008 by myself and Devlin Daly, who's in the back room. You don't know Devlin? That's Devlin. So a little bit of bio about me and Mike. I am one of the co-founders of Instructure. That's the entire history of my employment in the world. So straight out of grad school, started this company, wanted to do something to change the world. We were very fortunate that things came together in a way that we could actually do that. So the company's grown gangbusters, and I'm very pleased to be able to be a part of it. Mike Zackerson's been on board. I'll let actually introduce yourself, Mike.
Yeah, so just real quick, my whole career has been kind of building business models around supporting open source software specifically. Whether it was my time at Campus Pipeline and SunGuard Higher Education supporting uPortal and developing the Luminous product around that, or working with some companies that were developing support models for Sakai, Quali, and uPortal. And these are all examples of open source software communities that were driven by the higher education community to develop really good software for their own use. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
So we've both been playing in the education space. We've both seen a lot of and participated in open source projects. We've seen some stuff work well, we've seen some crash and burns, and that's kind of the goal, is to help give a little bit of perspective of historically what has worked and what hasn't, and maybe the lessons that hopefully we've learned. So the caveats, we're both very much on the software side, right? So open source as opposed to open licensed content. That's what we know really well. I think this doesn't translate to open content, but in a lot of ways it feels like the open content movement is not, maybe not far along, or maybe hasn't had as much adoption. So I think that there's great opportunities there. I think that there are some great business models there. I'm not going to be able to talk a whole ton about them, other than the things that I have observed, or I guess that's true for both of us, but other than the things that we've observed. So a couple of the key concepts that we want to make sure that we hit in this presentation. First of all, community obviously is super important in open source, and I think also in open content projects. Having that community is part of, I'm going to talk more about sustainability in a second, but it's part of the sustainability of the initiative. You don't want to make something, throw it out there to the world, and then it never gets updated and never gets modified again, because that tends to be less valuable. In the software world, it's dead code. And you can't use dead code for very long because it just becomes out of date and it no longer matches the new things that are happening, and it's hard to integrate and tie in. So having a community to keep the product, whatever it is, flourishing even as time goes on, I think is very important. And it goes to sustainability. That's one piece of sustainability, is having the community component. Another piece of, don't forget,
I'm missing a meeting today.
nice drop in the ball.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here, Mike.
Yeah.
Oh, before, what time is this presentation over? Is it 1:35 or 1:40?
140.
Okay, thank you. So another piece in sustainability just has to do with attention, right? There was a tweet that Bracken just shared with me earlier that talks about how open source runs on respect and appreciation. And there needs to be attention continually coming to whatever the initiative is in order for it to stay alive. And one way to do that is by having businesses that rely on that product staying up to date and flourishing. So that's what I know as one of the people that started Canvas, is building a business that relies on the open source product staying alive and flourishing. I think that having people that are monetarily motivated can be a great way to help sustainability. There's other ways to do it. A lot of times it ends up being money that's the driver though, right? Whether that's from grants or businesses that are pushed, that are fueling back into the initiative. There are different ways to do it, but it's important to make sure that as you are developing an open source project or looking to capitalize on one and help it improve, that sustainability is then the mindset. Otherwise, you end up with all that dead code. You end up with those lessons that are on some weird file format that nobody can watch anymore in videos, right? And you need to be able to have that sustainability in mind. The last one I'm actually going to let Mike talk a little bit about, which is the question of production versus adoption.
Yeah, and the point with this is just in community-driven, open development communities, the production function usually resides with the community itself, whereas adoption often resides with the users, and often it's on the adoption side where the most common business models emerge around consumption of these open assets. So it's businesses that are there to support the users in being successful using the open software or using the open content or understanding how to deploy those things across an organization and so forth. So that's really the point there, is that there is this distinction between how IP gets produced versus how it's used.
These are, just on Mike's point, these are a bunch of examples that we came up with of business opportunities that there are around open source or around open content. And I could talk about Canvas all day long, right? I mean, in the Canvas case, it's the support model, it's the hosting model, we are the training and implementation. It's all the services around the product, because at the end of the day, no institution wants to run, or at least most don't, want to run and be responsible for the uptime of something that's as critical as an LMS. They want to be able to get on the phone and yell at somebody, and they want somebody else to train their people, and they want to be able to file tickets and have somebody else actually fix their problems. And so all of those can feed back into sustainability, because Instructure is able to make money off of those offerings and then tie that back into the development of a product that continues to grow and improve and develop over time. The same thing has to happen, I believe, in the content space. I think that there are lots of opportunities to be able to build a business around, just like Mike was saying, the adoption perspective. It doesn't have to be around writing the code, but the services around it and the opportunities around it. Maybe it's, even if you're talking about like open textbooks, maybe it's the assessments around it or the delivery model around it. There's lots of ways that you can start to monetize in a healthy way around these ideas of open content. So that's, at a high level, that's the stuff we wanted to talk about. What I want to do now, by the way, we're going to put all these slides on SlideShare, so if you were like anxiously typing all of those bullet points, don't worry about it. What I want to talk about now is just some of the lessons that we've learned over time. Me at Instructure and Mike at Instructure and some of the other places he's worked, just talking about what we've seen work and not work. First of all, there's the idea that you get to define success. So often, when you start getting involved in business, people tell you what the right answer is, and they try to tell you, this is what it means to be a successful company. It means to go IPO someday and make millions of dollars. And maybe that's true for what you're trying to do, but honestly, maybe it isn't. It's important that you define what you want this initiative to look like at the end. And this is, you could call this Business 101, but I mean, the idea is you need to know what you want to accomplish. And then there's different routes to get there. If you're trying to go big and you're trying to get adopted by thousands of institutions, say for example like Instructure did, we needed venture capital money in order to be able to grow fast enough to be able to have the success and the growth and the money that we needed in order to do that effectively. So that was part of our definition of success, was to be able to raise VC money and grow to a certain number of institutions. That doesn't have to be the only measure of success. And some of the, I'm not going to name any names of companies, but some of the companies that I look at that have glommed onto open source projects or have tried to have more of an open content initiative that haven't worked so well or have had to pivot, I feel like part of the reason for that is because they had a definition of success that maybe it was working. And outside factors came in and said, no, that's not success. You don't know what you're talking about. This is the success that you should have. And they changed, or they had to revisit because they were listening to other people's definition of success instead of what their own definition of success was. So I think that's really important for a project. When Devin and I started in Structure, we wanted the code to be open source from the beginning. So we want to be open source, we want anybody to be able to use it. And we went out and pitched to VCs because we knew that was going to be a part of our definition of success. And they all say, you're crazy. People are going to steal your code. There's no way you'll be able to do this. We can't invest in you if you're going to do it open source. And we said, suck. That's terrible because that's part of what we want to do. And we think it's important. And we think it will work well in education. We were very fortunate and eventually we found some investors that were willing to take that risk on us. And also we were able to justify open source with a couple different messages as well. So at the end of the day, a lot of our potential customers started saying, we love your product, we love what you guys are doing. You're totally going to get bought by some other large LMS company in the next little while, and then we'll be right back where we started. So how do we know that's not going to happen? We say, we promise we're not sellouts, we promise that's never going to happen. They said, yeah, that's what everybody else said right before they got bought. And open source was actually a really great answer to that because we could say, no matter what happens, the code is out there and you can run it yourself. So all of a sudden we had a business justification that we could use. We could take that to investors and say, look, we need to be open source and you need to invest in us even though we're open source. And that got them over the hump to where we could get significant investment and be able to keep growing the company over time. So again, you need to have an understanding of what your definition of success is, and maybe it's not what matches with other people. And maybe you need to do a little bit of word finagling to get to the point where you can convince them that you actually know what you're talking about. But it's important at the end of the day that you can feel good about what you're doing, because that's what will drive you to keep moving forward. I'll let Mike talk about this next lesson.
Yeah, so this kind of plays into the idea of getting involved in the community. As a business leader, it's really critical that you're supportive of whatever community it is that stands behind the open IP that you're building a business around. And to kind of provide some color around this point, I was asked to make the first phone call to the uPortal community. It was a community called JSIG at the time, to propose to them that we wrap their open source code into the product that we were developing. And I wasn't sure how to expect that conversation to go, and surprisingly it went very well. But one thing that I learned through that process was that providing development effort to the community was key to us being a successful member to the community. So I organized with our company to have some developers dedicated to that community to contribute code, contribute ideas, and so forth. The play nice part comes in where we had some code that we contributed at one point, and my boss came to me and said, hey, that sounds like a really valuable contribution. We should probably put a patent on that, don't you think? And we're like, whoa, wait a minute. That is completely not the way you play with an open source community. And this was back in the early 2000s, and we were still trying to, as an industry, trying to figure out how to blend sort of commercial with open source at the time. But going through that experience, bringing resources into the communities is critical, and that buys you respect and trust within the community, and that allows you to have some ability to direct and participate in the evolution of that open asset. So,
the next one, I'm going to let you talk about this too.
Okay, so ask a high enough price. I've seen over the years many situations where this great bright group of people knew how to add value to the open source product that they were supporting, but they could only convince people to pay them so much. And so they started, you kind of have to do whatever it takes to get those first few customers. But you also have to keep in mind that you need to ask a high enough price that allows you to scale a business. Because at the end of the day, it does you or your customers no good if you ask such a low price that a year later you have to pull up the tent stakes and you're out of business at that point. And, and the other point here is to point out that building a business around open source IP is not about providing solutions at a lower cost necessarily. Often the openness and the solutions that come out of these communities are better than the proprietary alternatives that are out there. So in that regard, you have confidence to ask a high enough price because the value that you're delivering is actually more valuable than, the other alternatives in the market.
On that same note, sometimes I feel like a little bit of an outsider when we talk about the open community just because we're at a company that's been successful and is making money and on an open source project. But I think that we have to be careful that we don't automatically equate making money with selling out. Because I think that there are definitely opportunities to improve open source projects by getting money involved in them. And there's a risk that we run at times where we act like purists and we say, no, if there's money involved then it's tainted and you kill the spirit of the project. And that definitely happens. Like, I have seen that happen and it's a terrible thing. And there are some very recent examples of companies that have bought very large open source initiatives where that has totally happened. But that doesn't have to be the only way it goes. And I think we need to be careful that we don't discourage money making strictly for the sake of money making. I think we can discourage people that are selling out and doing things for the wrong reasons, but I think that there are great opportunities for business models to come up around open source projects that can, again, feed back into the community and feed back into the initiative and help it grow over time. So just a word of caution, but like Mike said, I think that there's lots of money to be made, and just because it's open source doesn't mean it has to be half price.
And if you do it right, the benefit, I think the next slide is about reinvest in the community. If you do it right, if you ask enough up front, then that creates a revenue stream that can allow you to reinvest back in the community. And that's part of the goal here, is that you have this symbiotic relationship between the communities who are producing the assets and those who are making money supporting and providing sustainability solutions. But some of that money that's being generated around the sustainability effort needs to be reinvested in the development effort so it continues to evolve and develop in a healthy way.
And when we talk about reinvesting in the community, talking again about just you have your own measure of success, you don't have to have the same open source community that MySQL has, right? Maybe at the end of the day, you need 3 people that are working on this project collaboratively. Or maybe maybe it's different than what people typically consider a successful open source community to look like. And in Structure, almost all of the development on Canvas happens in-house. Our open source community is almost completely Instructure employees. And some people say, well, that means you're not really open source. And maybe that's the case. I don't actually know. But for us, that's worked really well to have that community. We have people outside who help with the project. We have code contributions that happen on a regular basis. But we have enough money and enough investment that most of the development can happen in-house. And our community of consumers or adopters have said that works great for us because we know where you're going, we're very comfortable with that strategy, and it works well. And so I think that investing in the community may mean investing in a different type of community than what people tell you is traditional open source. But just keep that in mind. At the end of the day, it's what's successful for your initiative and for your project. The next one I want to talk about, sales and marketing actually do matter. One of the reasons that a lot of open source projects don't get adopted is because I don't know, this doesn't happen as much as it used to, but say like 5 or 10 years ago, open source projects were started by, a lot of the times, by nerds or by somebody who was in the field and enough of a nerd that they could write some code. So they said, yeah, I'm going to fix it, I'm going to build something better. And then I'm just going to throw it out there for the world, and whoever adopts it is going to adopt it, and that'll be great, and we'll all be happy. And that's great. It's wonderful that's happened. There's been a lot of great projects that have come out that way. As it takes a long time to get adoption if that's all you're doing. It's just saying, I'm going to put my code up on GitHub, and someday somebody will see it and fall in love with it. So that adoption piece is important. And marketing can help with it, and actually sales, if you can get businesses out there selling your project, whatever it is, that can be a huge trigger for growth, which then again can bring money into the companies that are working on the project, and then can help fuel additional development as well. So something to keep in mind. Mike, you want to talk about timing? No, we got the 5-minute mark.
We got a 5-minute mark. Yeah, so this is just pointing out that you know, when you're looking at an opportunity and you're looking to enter into the community and you know, get involved, timing does matter. I mean, you can get involved too early sometimes. I've seen some companies where they got involved in the community very early on, ended up burning through their seed capital, and you know, it didn't work out at the end of the day because the product in the community wasn't quite ready for a real business model to be formed around it. So timing is important, and you know, there's also this aspect that successful companies, it's often a matter of timing. You know, when did you come into the market with your offering? And you know, I've heard Brian mention that Canvas, you know, is successful partly because of good timing. You know, they came along at the right time with the right solution when the market was ready for an alternative. So that's the point there.
The last bullet, funding strategy matters. This goes back to defining your own success. You don't have to take VC money in order to be successful. Maybe that's what your project needs. Maybe it isn't. Sometimes, depending on how the open source community is set up, sometimes investment can be difficult. Because if it gets too disparate, then it's hard for an investor to say, oh, that looks like it will be successful. Because it's just, oh, you're one little piece, and there's so many things that you don't control, so that's scary to me. But there are people who will invest, and there are grants that you can get. And there are ways to be able to get the money you need in order to be successful, if that's what it takes is that investment. But that's something to keep in mind. As you define what your success definition is, part of that is going to be, what is the sustainable means of continuing to work on this project? And is it just new blood as people come in and get excited and to donate their time? Or is it investment? Is it a business that's going to crop up and is going to make money and keep doing development? Or is it we're just going to keep applying for grants every year? Or is it it's going to be funded by the institution, and so we don't need a lot of investment and that this will work over time? There has to be a sustainability perspective, I think, in order for these initiatives to be successful. So parting shots of advice, identify, actually, Mike, I'm going to let you talk about this because you put this one.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, some words of wisdom for communities who might be looking for commercial partners to help support and sustain their efforts. First of all, identify people who are good at collaboration. And the way you identify those people are seeing who's actually coming into the community and contributing to the community, develop those relationships of trust. Pick fewer partners. So I've been involved in a community where the community aligned its support model around just 1 or 2 providers of sustainability solutions, versus another community where it was a wide open field. And what happened was at the early stages of those projects, the limited dollars that were available toward funding sustainability solutions for the users of the products, those dollars got dispersed across a broad range of providers in the space, none of whom were able to really develop really healthy businesses out of those dollars. And so as a community, as you're thinking about sustainability, you know, try to be strategic around who you partner with and who you pick, and try to focus those dollars that are available for those functions, focus them to those partners so that they can build businesses that can scale. Because ultimately, you want to have a few partners that do have thriving businesses so that those dollars, you know, parts of their profits can go back into the community and help you, you know, with the ongoing development. And that goes to this point, encourage those who you pick to be active participants in the development process as well.
So parting shot, I think open license content and software is actually really great, really valuable. I just heard a story about these guys are in the front row. They're taking Khan Academy, they're throwing it on a Raspberry Pi, and they're sending it to places in the world that don't have good internet access. I think that's awesome. That could not have happened if Khan Academy hadn't open sourced their code. And honestly, the Raspberry Pi thing could have ever happened either if there wasn't a bunch of open source projects around it. So open source and open license content, it triggers fortuitous invention, as I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on this. But I think that it's great and it's valuable, and so it's worth the effort of justifying to potential investors because it makes a big difference. But these are some of the points to keep in mind as you try to come up with a business that can be sustainable around open content and open license software. So if you have any other questions, feel free afterwards to talk. But thank you guys for your time.